Thank you guys so much for coming. This is the first talk in the INTERchange series. This is an ongoing series focusing on artists working at the intersection of physical and virtual spaces. I actually had not planned on doing a talk for this series, but somehow nobody was available to do the first opening talk, so I decided that I would do it, so that's why I'm here. In case I need to do so, I'm Alex Dodge. I'm one of the founding partners here at Brooklyn Research. Most of you guys probably know Brooklyn Research, but a lot of you might not, so maybe I should talk about it a little bit. Brooklyn Research is a nonprofit organization that supports interdisciplinary research. We support research groups working in a range of fields and problem spaces. We also provide affordable workspace and resources to individuals working in a range of media and technologies. Our workshops offer artists, designers, and engineers unique access to tools and knowledge that can extend and inform their practice in new ways. Our lectures, panels, publications, and many of our workshops are free to the public. Please sign up for our newsletter or follow us on social media for future events. We also have a for-profit consultancy that builds interactive systems for a range of clients, including museums, artists, and leading technology firms. I received some emails prior to this with concern and disappointment over the disparity in gender representation in at least the first season of INTERchange. And I just want to make it clear that scheduling these things is really, really difficult, and somehow by chance all of the male artists were only available during the spring season, and all of the women artists were only available during the fall. So this is kind of how it worked out. But don't worry, it's actually pretty well represented on both sides. So, INTERchange, before I go further, I just want to say a special thank you to both of our directors, Daria Dubiskaya and also Oscar Solis, for all of their help in making Brooklyn Research work, making INTERchange possible. Thank you guys so much. When we talk about virtual spaces, we often think about VR or virtual reality, and there will definitely be some of that in the talks in this series, especially in the next one coming up by Adam Schechter, and in 2 weeks after that by Nitsan Vartov. But today we're going to be talking about virtualness and virtual spaces in a bit of a broader view. I think today I'm going to give you a way of talking about virtual spaces, what makes them unique, why I feel it's important to be talking about them right now. I'll also be talking about my own work, how the virtual has been an important dimension to its growth. I think in a lot of ways to talk about, we do have a lot of ways of talking about physical spaces, but maybe we need to build sort of a working framework, or at least I feel like it's been useful to build a working framework or definition of how to talk about virtual spaces. I think first and foremost we can talk about access. When we think about virtual spaces as definitively requiring specialized knowledge or hardware to access them, and this is kind of, I feel, what separates them from what we can call basic or relatively non-augmented physical experience. To gain access, we have to accept some systemic terms. By that, another way we can talk about access in terms of abstraction or encoding maybe. A layer or layers of abstraction is required for entry. If this is true, maybe we can think about language as being a type of first-order virtual space. Whether it's human language, computer language, math, musical notation, maybe talking about human language in this way is a little bit tricky. Depending on who you ask, we tend to think of the human mind or the brain as being language ready from birth. But we can imagine learning a second or even a third human language and how that will potentially open up access to other informational spaces or other experience through that. So I think that it does hold true. Language does have its own structure. You can talk about language in purely mechanical terms, but I think what I'm talking about is if we imagine any of these languages as really being as the source code that enables abstract thought, or at least internally understood or visualized worlds. So, but I think throughout this talk, I want to talk through different dimensions of virtual space. So, finance is something that I think about a lot. It's this underlying virtual space that governs so much of our daily life, and it's definitely more and more a virtual space that requires specialized knowledge and specialized hardware in many other cases. Social space is very much a virtualized space, I think, more and more so now. Access here is very clear. Either you buy into the platform or you're not part of the conversation. So we can also talk about this notion of access and how that can let us approach kind of known and more or less familiar forms. I make paintings. How does this idea of technological access, how can we talk about painting in that way? Maybe for the most part, this is Grant Wood. If any of you haven't gone to the Whitney, then you should definitely go. It's an amazing show. But I think that in many ways we can think of, at the very, very least, maybe kind of suspension of disbelief is like this kind of intuitively activated means of accessing imagery in a painting. And I think that that's something that is fairly intuitive for most people. Whereas maybe other paintings, maybe this is more intuitive than that for some people, and maybe less for others. That's Joan Mitchell. And most likely it seems more than obvious, but it's probably worth stating if we're trying to talk about a working definition of virtual spaces, that simulation is sort of a core principle there, that virtual spaces are capable of simulating known phenomena and also simulating things that are not known. And my work relies heavily on simulating known experience in a sense. My work relies heavily on 3D physics engines that simulate Newtonian physics, in this case, draped fabric. And again, we can think about languages of different sorts, natural and non-natural, as being able to simulate spaces or other experience. Musical notation, MIDI, other electronic forms are able to simulate performed musical compositions and things that are not performed even. So, simulation is something that we can think about also in the sense of going back to economics and market economies. We can think about these markets as multi-layered simulations of value, where actuals, meaning physical goods and things that are traded, are substituted for fiat currency, and then that in turn gets simulated in higher ordered layers of abstraction. Funds, derivatives, options, whatever, virtual cryptocurrencies. These are all layers of virtualization or simulation that we can think of in that respect. And I think that our social spaces have become incredibly rich, but largely text-based simulations of experience. And so from there, I think that we can move on to what I'd like to call parametricity or parametrics. And inherent to virtual spaces abstraction or systemness is a tendency to be parametric. And so what do we mean by that? Because there is a simulation or an underlying functions that can be varied, these are parameters, and they can be varied with because of their abstractness, they can be varied with little or no effort. Again, going back to music, I think that music is such an interesting case because of its sort of low-level mediation and its very powerful parametric nature. In straight notation or in the form of a MIDI file or MIDI program, you're able to drastically change the way a composition or musical format can be experienced. Just with a few marks, you can change tempo or change the key of a composition, and that's fairly powerful. That level of abstraction that is able to change that experience. It's unlike what's required to change things in physical terms. Within simulated 3D worlds, we start with a version of Newtonian physics and Euclidean geometry, but we're not necessarily bound to it. And I think this is something that's really interesting that I think about a lot in my work, is that we can change the flow of time, we can increase, reduce gravity, we can change the way gravity works, we can decide if we wanted to, we could write a new equation and decrease gravity linearly with distance rather than its square. Or we could pulse it maybe, what kind of a world would that feel like? And I think these are things that we can actually do now, at least in a simulated sense. I think non-Euclidean spaces are something very interesting. I don't know that they'll find a place in my own work, but I find them very intriguing that you can now, within virtual spaces, within virtual reality, you can experience non-Euclidean space. And I find it very interesting that they're very intuitive, that they don't follow the rules of space that we know in our walking, waking kind of lives, but we can still navigate them in a fairly intuitive way. This is a non-Euclidean VR project by Henry Siegerman and others. So I think that that's sort of a core thing, is the ability to change the fundamental laws of our worlds, our simulated worlds so easily, is a truly powerful thing. And again, going back to finance and market economies and this world, the parametric creation of wealth, seemingly from thin air, and then 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 poof, it's gone. It's kind of a crazy time that we live in, with just in the last couple of weeks, Bitcoin went from where it was, and now it's reacting to something. Another thing I think about a lot is something called agent-based modeling. This is something that's used a lot in architecture when the need to understand how lots and lots of people will react in a particular floor plan, how fast people will be able to evacuate in the case of a fire. But I think agent-based modeling is a form of a virtual space that we can think about where the parameters, the parametric nature of it becomes even more abstract, because we can start to think about, well, there's a parameter for plurality, more agents. That's then you can also start to have even more abstract things where, aggressiveness or other kinds of sociality, randomness, these kinds of things are ways of simulating the way that lots of people interact in a physical space or otherwise. And so these are really virtual agents interacting in a virtual world, but this doesn't feel so far from real agents interacting in a virtual social space. And I think that's something that we really are dealing with very, very much in the last year. I think that we've become more and more aware of that. Misinformation is nothing new. For sure, this is like an election poster from the 1890s, embracing the scum or deplorables, maybe. These are all old tactics, but I don't think that until now that the ability to use misinformation has been weaponized with such effectiveness. That's their actual website, so I mean that kind of just says it all. I mean it's amazing to think about that. I mean, what does it really mean to live in a world with parametric social spaces where the control knobs and switches can be sold for the right price? And next I want to talk about totality. So totality is something that we can think of as an aspect of virtual spaces, is that through their abstraction and layering, we gain this ability as architects of these spaces to be able to see them in their totalness or their whole. We can see worlds holistically and instantially, more or less at the same time, and that's something that's pretty incredible. There's not just spatial totality, we can think about temporal totality. The difficulty is how to interpret these views. In time series data, there's typically a means of interpreting it is by placing it in bins or buckets, but how large those things are can drastically change the way that we interpret that totality. Next, I want to talk about optimization. By necessity, virtual spaces are optimized spaces. Human-computer interaction has since the very beginning been an optimization game. Getting the most out of as little processor cycles and memory as we possibly can. We can see this in the very early days of digital imagery. The systems were optimized for human perception. The way that the human eye responds to levels of gray, we don't see that many changes in light. We see more in the dark range. So that's why our computer systems were optimized, because there's only so much memory that you can use, so you better optimize it for the way that the human eye can see. And then, of course, there's JPEG compression, which is all perceptually driven. Music can be understood in a optimized or quantized space, and of course there's MP3, which is largely just throwing away stuff that we don't notice or consciously hear. So it's tempting, I think, oftentimes when we think about optimization to really think that this is rooted in technology. But the thing that it's really kind of interesting to think about is that it's very, very much rooted in biology. Our brain is a highly optimized system and structure. This is an idea which is fairly well accepted, called dual process theory, where we have system 1 and system 2 processes. And our brains have evolved to be able to utilize system 1 processes, which are fast, unconscious, kind of implicit things. These are the things that we have to be able to operate very, very quickly. These are the things that probably keep us alive or kept us alive in more turbulent environments. And then system 2 are things that are more processor intensive. These are highly draining of glucose in the brain, and those are the analytical, kind of our analytical power. If anybody's interested more in that, Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow, is a great introduction to applied dual process theory. So I think if we had to come up with a general optimization function for virtual spaces, it might look something like that. This is sort of a pseudo function, but this idea really is that, I mean, this is really, I think, why we're having this conversation right now. It's only been very recently that computational speed limits and other hardware barriers and obstacles have been overcome to allow certain types of virtual spaces, namely VR. But these technological advances have had major impacts on less glamorous and less obvious types of virtual spaces as well. For example, this is a friend, Vincent Houzet's piece called Fluid Structure. And this is kind of an incredible thing because these are highly complex fluid dynamics that are being generated, but this is all being done in real time. And this is something that is relatively recently possible on at least on affordable hardware. This is an installation that reacts in real time to people in the space, and you know, this is sort of unheard of until recently. This is using NVIDIA's Flex physics engine, and this is all stuff that's really, I mean, video games have been driving this because you need things to be real-time renderable or real-time generated in order for them to be playable. So, but as an artist, I think that this is something that's been incredibly powerful because the difference about being able to use technologies that are immediate in a studio rather than setting up an animation and then waiting for it to render for hours and then coming back and seeing that it doesn't look quite right. You know, that's not an intuitive process. So this level of immediacy that we've been able to attain with faster computers basically is, you know, pretty amazing. So from there, let's bring it back. Try to bring it back a little bit into the physical. I came across the work of Imar de Vries, who's a media scholar, and his book, Tantalizingly Close, is sort of a historical comparative analysis of how we've gotten to where we are with mobile devices and informational technologies. And the whole book is great, but one area in the book which I kind of really grasped was where he in turn talks about the work of Albert Borgman and Pierre Levy, both contemporary philosophers who have written about media and technology extensively. They both describe sort of this progression of informational spaces that relate to physical experience. And basically, that progression follows this idea of propositional knowledge space, which is described as information about reality. This is information that describes our physical experience, the way that we are experiencing the world. And then the next being a progression to procedural knowledge, which is information for producing or realizing, creating the world that we live in. And finally, arriving at a virtual knowledge space, which is information as reality. And I think that's kind of, you know, what we've been talking about, and seeing how that space is evolving right now, how it continues to be empowered by new technologies oftentimes, and also just by new ideas. But the case where Borgman and Levy differ is that Borgman sees this third space, this virtual knowledge space, as being potentially dangerous in the sense that it has the potential to become disconnected or untethered from the physical. Levy is more optimistic in the sense that he sees that the virtual is inevitably always rooted firmly in the physical, that it's inseparable. And so that although it may seem that a lot of these spaces are becoming lawless sort of enclaves on their own, that inevitably they have to answer back to physics on some level. It's understandable, I think, to take Borgman's view when we kind of look at things like deepfakes, because, you know, things like that are only going to get better. Yet somehow I think I remain optimistic, perhaps hopeful in seeing that even in our current situation with virtual social spaces, as you know, maybe these are inevitable growing pains. Maybe when we are given new tools, we inevitably feel the need to perform old tricks with them and ask old questions in new ways. But perhaps this, as however painful, is a kind of stress testing. But I think this relationship between the virtual and the physical has to be reconciled in a consistent and reliable way. After all, if we were to take virtualness or virtualization to, you know, the extreme point where we are, say, uploading our consciousnesses in a Kurzweilian kind of way or whatever, you know, somebody or something still has to keep the power running. Otherwise, you know, that's not a very good place to be. So I feel like in that kind of imagined extreme, physical accountability, you know, has to be ensured on some level. You know, perhaps we need better models to help us travel between these virtual spaces, how to manage the virtual with the physical. We seem to be struggling with this at the moment with the ability to discern fact from fiction, maybe, within our media and social spaces. And I think that this will probably only get more difficult in the short term. So we will probably need better ways of verifying what's real from what's not real. Things like blockchain, other technologies will probably become increasingly important. I think one of the approaches that a lot of people have talked about in that kind of realm is an immunological approach. And by that, it's kind of using biological systems as a model, much like an immune system for figuring out you know, what's good, what's bad, or what's real, what's not real. But I think that, you know, whatever system that is that we can come up with, it still has to be something that will allow for creativity and generative behavior. You know, I think that if we think about ourselves on that kind of cellular system level, I mean, you know, we are beings that are made up of cells that are discernibly human in the sense that they are derived from DNA that we inherit from our parents, but also in large part, we are, you know, summations or combinations of very non-human cell structures, which are largely bacteria, you know, our microbiome. We are systems in balance, not strict centralized managers of that regulate us from them. I think that evolutionarily we seem to work best as balanced but diverse systems. I think that historically we've seen centralized approaches fail when they try to scale. Totalitarian regimes are those to watch as they attempt to grow while maintaining restricted freedoms alongside the need for innovation and the ability to adapt. Speed versus adaptability, maybe. Where places like the United States are less centralized and with media that is vulnerable to exploitation in different ways. We don't have a centralized filtering agency, at least not exactly. which means that ideas can spread freely and more quickly in some ways, not always good ones. Instead, we have a distributed filtering system, and one that kind of operates on a platform level and also on an individual level. One way we can think about this is that centralized systems, such as those in places that are run by dictatorships, is that these require immense amounts of energy to refine a clean, noiseless signal. Distributed systems, however, allow for noise, and because of this, these systems can be incredibly robust and resilient, even in the case where large amounts of biased or false noise is injected into a system. These systems, in theory, can weather the storm. So we shall see. Talking in biological terms, it's worth mentioning for a moment that I've largely overlooked one of the probably most current virtual spaces that is kind of before us, which is genetics. And it really is, in many ways, the best example of a transit point between virtual and physical space. However, I think that as amazing as the discoveries have been in genetics, it's still very much in a nascent kind of form, and something that I'm kind of reluctant to kind of approach, especially even though that we, when we really think about DNA to RNA to protein, this really is a perfect example of a language, with 4 bases, A, G, T, C, that is reconciled, decoded into a physical form. I mean, that's kind of as perfect as it gets. Yet, genetics is a problematic case in this. We so want genes to be a clean and perfect story, where we have a clear causal relationship with who we are. People talk about the warrior genes, or as a way of explaining, how this person is more aggressive or a better athlete. DRD4 genes associated with novelty seeking, and these are, such tempting ways of trying to explain the way that we are. There's such perfection in genetic code. However, these are great stories, but they're totally incomplete, I think. Genetic determinism is something that we have to be very careful with, in its current form at least. I very much recommend Robert Sapolsky's recent book, Behave, if you're interested in this topic at all. Technologies such as CRISPR-Cas9, which have been revolutionary in the field, are major developments, yet we don't have models that can fully simulate DNA to RNA to protein with levels of complexity, accounting for environmental factors and expression that would allow us to simulate variations in a theoretically complex organism, at least faster than real time. I mean, faster than growing it. So that's sort of one of the reasons why I think it's complicated to talk about genetics as a fully virtual space. There's definitely a virtual aspect to it, but one that we don't have access to. Maybe another model, though, that we can use to interpret this transit point between the virtual and physical is something that we're all very aware of, but something that we often fail to remember in the morning. I think that dreams are something that I've spent great lengths thinking about and writing about on my own, but we still don't fully understand really what they are. I think a lot of research kind of shows that dreams are probably related to ways that we regulate, analyze, and process memory. Kind of a mental housekeeping that's kind of talked about. And like other virtual spaces, we've mentioned dreams are optimized neurofunctional spaces. This mental housekeeping has to be done when everyone else has left the office, in a sense. And if dreams are a system 1 process, and it looks for the most part like they are, at least for non-lucid REM sleep. It's a process that is optimized to run when system 2, our waking conscious mind, is not functioning. And this is kind of fascinating work done by Kamitani Lab at Kyoto University, where this is an actual recording of dreams using neural networks trained to interpret fMRI imaging. So maybe dreams are a good model for how we can think about virtual spaces, in that these spaces are ways of refining, testing, and pushing our physical, or at least our understanding of physical experience in ways that we otherwise can't. So I think that virtual spaces offer immensely powerful tools, but with all powerful tools, we have to understand how to use them in ways that are not problematic or abusive. So when is isolated, if we do think about that, well, like when is isolated violence in a virtual space a good way of sublimating desires that would otherwise result in physical harm? And then, when is a virtual space an amplifier of violence that spills over? These are kind of the classic video games argument, and it's a difficult argument to completely answer. But our ability to wake from dreams and either forget them or be able to discern them from physical reality, this has been an ability that I think probably it's been a very important one, to be able to discern the difference between the two. Yet we all have had bad dreams that have spilled over into our waking lives. And so even there are permeable boundaries. It may be the case that from dreams we can gain an understanding, or at least get accustomed to living in a realm that is perpetually between worlds, a kind of lucid dream. That might be a kind of future that is in store. So from here I want to talk about my own work. Virtual space and points of physical transit between the virtual space to the studio. And within my studio has been a very important aspect, especially in more recent work. So in my case, the use of 3D modeling and other kinds of virtual technologies, this was initially very much a stubborn solution to a technical problem, rather than an eager embrace of new technology. After undergrad, I was making paintings based on underwater views of Olympic-style swimming pools. And this was something that kind of came about from personal experience swimming. And I think it was sort of this obsession that I'd had from a very young age, but there was something about this immersive aquatic kind of world that I felt was so captivating that it was, in a sense, I think now I can kind of understand it almost as a virtual space itself, in the sense that when we're submerged in water in this kind of liquid world, there's a weightlessness to the body. There's a freedom of motion in any direction, really hindered only by the need to surface for air. And that's true of all virtual spaces. In a sense, we can't survive in them indefinitely. But there's also sort of a wonderful metaphor that existed in there. The scattered fluid reflections on the water's surface seemed a perfect metaphor for a boundary between two worlds, where the perfect rectilinear architecture of the lane markers and the grid tiling, this was sort of broken in a swirling chaos as it met the world above. So my first attempts to make these paintings went about in a very kind of intuitive way. This was the year 2001, I think, and so I had like a film camera instead of a digital camera because they were too expensive back then, and you wouldn't take them in a swimming pool anyway. So I took underwater film photos and then tried to work from those, projecting them in studio onto canvas, and those images were terribly murky and didn't really look anything like the experience that I had kind of enjoyed. So when I came to New York, a good friend of mine at the time was working in video games and suggested, well, why don't you just build the space in 3D and model it. And at first I thought this was kind of a crazy idea. Why go to all the trouble of modeling a 3D software, which I had no experience with at the time anyway. But it became immediately clear after doing that that this window had kind of opened. And that by recreating these spaces virtually, being able to understand the entirety, the totality of these spaces was incredibly powerful. I could see these spaces in ways that was never really possible with a physical camera. And at this point, I was using these systems in a purely simulational term. And by that I mean that as empowering as it was to be able to understand a physical space in its totality, I was basically just simulating or recreating an actual or potential space. So this is actually not a painting. This is a print that I produced with Luther Davis, a master printer who I've done a lot of work with, and he's sort of very much a printmaking genius and always a pleasure to work with. But this was built up using multiple layers of UV varnish, screen printed. And so even at this stage, tactility and that kind of physical presence of the image, however it came to be in a digital or simulated origin, that physical tactility and presence in that way was always something that was very important. Over the years, I've begun to understand how these tools can be used not just to simulate the known, but to generate the unknown. And I think that that's something that has become increasingly exciting in my studio work. The recent work from the past few years grew from a desire to find ways of describing or reconciling forms of digitally mediated experience in a physical format. I attended grad school at NYU's ITP program after having a studio in New York for nearly 10 years. So it was kind of a crazy time to go to grad school, at least it felt like it at the time. But this is how I came to partner with Johnny Liu and Azer Longinus, my partners at Brooklyn Research, and all the wonderful people that helped build this space. But post-ITP wasn't an easy kind of time for me. I had been kind of thoroughly submerged in a world of code, coming out, seeing the world in computational terms, which was beautiful in many ways, but also kind of debilitating. I came from painting and with a love of paint and physical material and the artifact and its historical power. I wasn't sure really what painting would look like being seen through that more or less kind of computationally colored lens. And so these were the first paintings I made after grad school. And I've never shown them publicly. I'm not sure if they're particularly good paintings, but they were incredibly important in getting to a place where I am now. These were produced using a intentionally crude 3D scan of an actual still life of bottles and I think they were limes. And I think at the time I was sort of rethinking Cezanne and the transition that he helped enable toward modernism and rethinking of space and form. I was thinking about how I could revisit a parallel using current tendencies and optimized geometries for 3D modeling and video games, and how they spoke in similar formal but very different functional terms. So these were among the first stencil-based paintings that I created. Around the same time, I happened to be watching in the morning NHK, which is sort of the Japanese PBS, a documentary about katazome textile dyeing while I was eating breakfast, and you know, the stencils in katazome by themselves are just incredibly beautiful objects. But the way that they're used, scraping a rice paste through the open stencil onto the textile, which acts as a resist when it's being used for dyeing. But immediately I started to look at that and say, like, that viscosity, you know, feels very much like oil paint. And I immediately realized that I'd been thinking about stencils all wrong, at least the way that I was using them to make paintings. And so I remember writing that day in studio and really thinking about what stencils are and kind of meditating on that, and really what stencils and I guess really what certain types of printmaking can be. And I came to the conclusion that a stencil and its print can be this incredible fusion of things that is totally unique. They simultaneously allow for complexity, for tactility, and immediacy. And I think you know, in that they're capable of holding incredible informational density in a physical medium, something that is physically present, but they're also very fast. And so that's an incredibly unusual combination. And you know, since we're talking very much about technologically enabled processes and spaces today, it's important to remember that everything we do digitally is enabled really by a type of print or a type of stencil-enabled print. Every microprocessor that drives our devices, our internet, this is a very physical print. We don't think about it as a physical print, but it's made using a type of stencil. It's very much physical, very much complex, and very much immediate. Probably the most complicated print ever created. But after coming to these realizations about katazome, I also began thinking about repetitive textile pattern, which katazome is also very good at. In early paintings, I kind of intuitively thought that shadow and transparency was this thing that was necessary, even when I started using pattern as a way of describing space. But it became pretty clear after a few works that you know, our minds are these incredible pattern recognition engines that just a pattern that's distorted spatially is enough to describe a form. And I thought that that was such a beautiful and simplistic way of understanding a spatial and tactile kind of experience. And this also became a way for me of interpreting digitally mediated experience. And remember, that's kind of what I'd been thinking about, ways of describing that. Acting as a spatial metaphor for a logical system, a digital system, which is, as they are, sort of agnostic to what is filtered through it. And I started to think about that almost like a pattern draped over an object, how it describes that object with a level of fidelity that increases with sample rate or resolution or the density of a pattern. But that sample rate or resolution, it's never really the experience itself. And so I thought that that was sort of appropriate in that rather than a shadow of it, it sort of describes experience as it simultaneously obscures it. I can talk a little bit about my process, about how things kind of happen on a daily basis in studio. Oftentimes, now I really enjoy starting with crude sort of ink drawings. And these sort of come about with the intention of describing situations that are something that I'll later try to simulate to create a spatially distorted pattern, which will in turn become a stencil. So there's sort of like this circular thing that happens. I think it starts with a largely an immediate physical impulse that then goes into this very abstracted digital space, and then eventually comes back out as a stencil, which allows for this immediate application of material. And these forms that are created, some of them are created entirely from simulations that, I might know the general idea of what's going to happen, but it's very exciting to see, for me, going back to, this, the current technology that enables that immediacy, that I can watch a form unfold really within seconds as a physical, virtualized physical process. And then others are sort of more or less modeled from scratch. So I think this is recent work that I've been trying to find ways of incorporating not just pattern, but also printed media. This is all oil on linen, so they're just oil paintings. But finding ways of having informational density in different ways. But I think these really came out of this desire to kind of understand sort of where we are right now. And I think we live in a world sort of that moves at a relentless pace of media. I think that as an artist, as artists, our creative practice has to find ways of adapting to our environment, that we make the most of the resources and abilities that we have, or the constraints that are imposed upon us. So, making paintings in a time, when attention spans continue to dilate, and headlines continue to be bleak. This is not an easy. It's not been an easy time for me to make work, but I think finding ways of being able to enjoy this point of transit between, or interchange, between physical and virtual becomes increasingly important for me as a way of trying to create relevant and accessible objects that can endure physically. That I think that was something really important about using the New York Times, was something in a way of like trying to find a way of understanding media, making it something that's physical, that does endure, that does matter more than a few seconds. Yeah. Thank you. And then if anybody has any questions or anything, there's a microphone. This is all being live put onto the internet, so that's why it helps if you do have a question, then you can speak into the mic. Maybe nobody has any questions. That's okay too. Yeah.
I'm sorry, this is a little on the technical side, but like I understand the way you're using stencils, but I have no idea how you're getting the effects from the New York Times, especially that photograph. I mean, that seemed so complex and
Sure.
detailed.
Yeah, this is something that sort of progressed. I was doing paintings that a little bit earlier that were based off of crumpled dollar bills, and the way that I started to approach that, those are much less have much less density of information in them, and I was really just making woodblock prints, and pressing those into semi-wet oil paint as a way of kind of capturing. Otherwise, you could just do a screen print. But I really wanted to be able to capture that kind of tactile, almost letterpress-like feel with the text and the imagery. And so, the dollar bills were pretty easy. There's not a lot of, there's only a couple of colors, which made it not too hard to register things. But, that worked. So then I felt like, well, why not 4 colors? Why not CMYK? So really, they're just wood blocks, but they're CMYK wood blocks that are hand registered and pressed into paint. So it's a little insane to make them, but they're a lot of fun. So yeah, so that's basically it's an old technology, process color, but used in a new way. But the one thing that's really important about these is that these are not real New York Times. These are virtual New York Times that are crumpled and mangled and put into. So I recreate a version of the New York Times as a virtual model, and then affect it and manipulate it in a virtual space. So, which helps the text because it's hard to scan
Are those manipulations intuitive, or are they dictated by some kind of parameters?
That's been an interesting thing. Like it's really the process of manipulating objects in a virtual space becomes a whole other problem because you know what a New York Times is, but you don't understand the physics of it intuitively often. So creating a polygonal surface that behaves similar to the way a creased New York Times that's quarter folded. How do you prime a polygonal surface to be able to have a tendency to fold in that way? And you kind of figure out ways of doing that. You create topologies that have higher density in the fold regions, and then you apply gravity to it and let it kind of do what it does. And then sometimes when it doesn't look right, you can nudge it a little bit. But I really do love letting things just kind of happen. I think that it's my own kind of private show that I get to have at studio, is really watching these things become in a simulated world, and that's an aspect of the work that nobody else ever sees. Yeah.
So the paper is in the space of the engine, right? Because are you using an engine for that, or?
Yeah, I mean, this is a physics engine,
Yeah.
and there's different ones that I've used. I mean, a lot. I have to say that NVIDIA's Flex stuff it's really pretty good in terms of how fast it is and how well it works. But there's Bullet Physics is another one that works pretty good, which is an open source one, which is always nice. But yeah, so these are basically just using Newtonian physics. However, oftentimes I will adjust gravity, making a gravity more intense or less intense, and that's something. I mean, ultimately, I think that when we talk about simulation, or really technology of any kind of digital technology, most of the time when it comes down to it, it's about making things faster and more convenient. I don't think there's anything that I've made a painting of yet that couldn't be done purely with some physical setup. I mean, I think that there's certainly ways that you could create a pattern cloth, create a structure, drape that on that structure, take a photograph of it in high contrast, turn that into a stencil, hand cut it if you wanted to. I mean, I think ultimately, when we talk about an artist's practice and their process adapting to a lived situation, a lived environment, is that we do have to adapt our process to be able to, in many ways, the way that I feel is that we have to compete with an environment that is oftentimes so fast-paced that it's hard. How do we do things that remain interesting to ourselves when so much is changing around us so quickly? So oftentimes, what might have been interesting to do, 10 years ago or more, with painstaking labor, might have felt really fulfilling in a way, doesn't feel that way maybe to some people now. And definitely to me, I feel like, yeah, if I can cut the stencil with a machine, that doesn't really matter that much to me, because ultimately what I want is something that can produce a tactile, physical painted effect or material on the canvas. And I think that's, the technical problem solving can be fun. Can also be a huge burden as well. As we sort of go down rabbit holes of technology, we become sort of slaves to them at some point as well. So I think that that's always a balancing act. Understanding the tools that we use in a way that they can continue to empower the work that we do, rather than becoming, something that we are dependent upon. I might have gone off topic, but yeah.
No, actually, it answers one of the questions.
Okay, yeah.
That I hadn't yet asked.
Oh, good. Well, that's it. I just want to thank you guys so much. This is sort of, tonight was a really something of an experiment in the sense that, this is a series where we're not really sure where we're going. I think we have very broad bounds in terms of the kinds of artists and kinds of work that we're going to be looking at, and the ways that we're talking about it. And I think that that's sort of intentionally the way I wanted to structure it. But just the fact that so many of you showed up tonight is a huge success, and I really appreciate it. So thank you so much.